Good morning and evening, everyone, and welcome to the CMI Regional Voice, Singapore Practical Empathy, Balancing Compassion with Business Needs. My name is Mel, and I'm Events Coordinator here at CMI. I'll shortly be handing over to Manoj Menon, who is running the session today, along with Judge Magnus. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can ask them using the live chat box on the right of your screen, and we shall answer as many as we can. Today's session is being recorded, and it will be shared later on today. Now over to Manoj to commence.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mel. Very good morning to you, and very good evening to all our friends in Asia. Really delighted to have this incredible opportunity to have this conversation on practical empathy. So a special welcome to all fellow members of CMI Singapore. I know this session has been a few months in the making, and we are really thrilled to have finally had this opportunity to be here. As a quick background, we started this conversation on what it needs to, what are the key attributes to become a good manager or a better manager. And the CMI Singapore members got together. We spent an hour and a half brainstorming, and we looked at all the attributes. In today's world, if you want to be a great manager, a great leader, it needs so many different attributes. We eventually, after a lot of discussion, we nailed down on three: empathy, agility, and trust. And we said we should have real conversations on each of these three issues over the course of the next year, and bring together distinguished practitioners in each area who could share with us their learnings, their lessons, so that we can get better at it. Yes. And that's how this session came about. So the first topic we picked was empathy. And as we picked that subject, then we started researching who would be the best person in the country to tell us about what it means to be a true empathetic leader. And that's how we got to Judge Richard Magnus. And a quick introduction to Judge Richard Magnus. He retired after a distinguished public service over 40 years with the Singapore Legal Services. He's a recipient of the Meritorious Service Medal by the state for exceptional public service, and he has also received the Outstanding Volunteer Award by MSF. He's currently a chairman of Public Transport Council. He's on several boards of private sector companies, on public sector organizations. And I also asked him, if someone were to meet him in a MRT or a subway, how would he introduce himself, right? So he said, I would like to be introduced as a jurist, as a writer, as a philanthropist, as a corporate manager, as a preacher, and as a bioethics practitioner. So truly honored to have you here, Judge, and looking forward to continuing the conversation that we couldn't complete last time.
Yeah. So Manoj, I think before you carry on, I just want to apologize for the last distress we had caused the CMI practitioners as well as to the other candidates. I just want to apologize to you at the last session, and I therefore agreed to come back again. And I think this is a conversation that I've been looking forward to. And I want to thank CMI and to thank Manoj especially for holding this particular session.
Thank you.
So good morning and good evening to all.
Yeah, and we love the comment section. So please type in the comment what you like, what you want to comment as Judge response. If you have specific questions, please put it there. And we would love to see if we can answer all of them. But keeping the interaction going as this session progresses will add to and make this conversation a two-way rather than a one-way. So let me, in the beginning, first itself, 2020 is a remarkable year. None of us in our entire lifetime, I don't think there's anybody who can say they could have predicted, anticipated what a year this has been. It's coming to an end finally, maybe hopefully, and a new beginning.
Yes.
So is empathy of 2020 different from empathy of the past?
Yes. I think if I go back to the very, very far past, way back to the time of Plato and Socrates, where they developed a framework of logos, a framework of ethos, a framework of pathos. And they put this together in order to make a coherence. So the origin of empathy comes from the root word pathos, but it must be combined together with ethos. There must be the ethical applications of it. There must also be a logical coherence to it, which is the logos part. So it is within that family that empathy is recognized and empathy will have its dignity only within that family. So that is the past. And in the last decade or so, the word empathy has in the Oxford Dictionary taken on a new profile. It is now one of the 1 million words that's been used commonly in the corporate world, in the social conversation, in ethical discussions, as well as in financial policies and government policies. So the empathy has taken on a new momentum. It has become an everyday word, so to speak, it becomes a daily word. But the application of empathy, depending on the sector and the industry, differs. So, for example, like in the Industrial Revolution, which is not very far, many years ago, and I think our British colleagues are very familiar with that. In the Industrial Revolution, empathy was completely missing in the production of goods. One size fits all in terms of the manufacturing. They do not care about what consumers want. They don't care very much about what consumers' needs are. They just manufacture them on a mass production basis.
Yes.
So that was the fault of the Industrial Revolution. And therefore, there was a rebellion, if you like, against it by the market and by the consumers. And therefore, empathy became then a byword post the Industrial Revolution. So now it has become a word which is now used in common everyday fashion by corporate leaders, by financial sectors, policymakers, and everybody else. So there is a great intensity of the word. It's taken a new life.
Correct.
Empathy, yeah.
I remember an anecdote. You said the word empathy is not very old in terms of history.
Yes.
Yeah.
The word empathy, I think, if you look at the Google's Newgram traces the use of the word over a period of time, and it's found that this word was only used quite recently in the last decade. The empathy. So the idea that CMI has come up with the fact that empathy is number one on looking at what a good manager is.
Better manager.
I think it's a great coincidence, and I think I just want to appreciate CMI for coming there on his own, so to speak. Yeah.
Excellent. So one of the foremost questions, and as business leaders, we are faced with this. On one end, you have some of the world's most empathetic brands. They're the global tech giants. They are valued at now $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion,
Yes.
some of them.
Yes.
And yet we hear announcements in the press, they are laying off people.
Yes.
Right. So how do you rationalize it? Because as managers, as leaders, we are trying to understand, man, you are saying you are an empathetic brand.
Yes.
You have so much money, and at the same time you're laying off people. How does it work? Is it right? Is it not right? Are they doing wrong? They should not be.
Yeah. I think there's a dissonance between that, as well as between empathy, technology, and the fact that people are being affected. There's a dissonance in that. But I think for empathy, we need to take a long-term view. Just now you asked about whether there's a change in the last decade. That's exactly the longitudinal view that we need to take about empathy. So if you look at technology and the effect of technology on employment,
Yes.
the effect of technology on companies performance, 60% of the technological companies are the best, highest ranking companies in the world right now. So what does technology do? Technology begins to read intelligently what the needs of the market are. They're able to do machine learning, for example. They're able to do algorithm in terms of finer granularity of what the needs of the market are. So they can be empathetic to a fine point. So that's the beauty of it. That's my first answer. My second answer is that technology helps in culture building. And I think I mentioned the last time, Manoj, when we had a conversation, I said that Peter Drucker says that culture eats strategy at breakfast. So technology helps culture building. And that culture is important and made more refined, made more robust, made more dynamic by technology. Yeah.
So so you're saying the answer to that is you take a more longer term view than a current view, and therefore, in a way, you got to do it because it is the right thing to do for the organization.
Yes.
And
yes. Because the default is what? The default is no technology. And then you are back again to, the problems that we have in order to understand better processes, make it more productive, more efficient. So technology is here to stay. So the question is, how do you balance the application of the technology in terms of empathetic culture of the company, in terms of human power, in terms of manpower? So culture processes can be determined by technology, but also at the same time, technology is important in order for us to decide how do we relate that to manpower. You talk about manpower layoffs, manpower redundancies. In those processes themselves, there is an empathetic application of it.
Correct.
How do you lay off? When do you tell a person? Do you send a person just a letter, an impersonal letter, or do you speak to the person? Taking care of the person's needs at the same time.
So now, for example, now many of our managers in Singapore, for example, we are faced with a tough situation. Economy is not doing as well.
Yes.
We are faced with a situation where maybe it makes more sense to take some jobs in Malaysia and Philippines and other countries where it is cheaper to do. At the same time, we feel obligated. Hey, you know what? I need to support the country. I need to keep jobs.
Yes.
How do we rationalize it? What is the rational, at a very practical level? Is there something, what is your advice to these managers?
I think that's an excellent question, because it reaches into a deeper issue. The deeper issue is, do we still keep to the same manpower policy? Do we keep to the same paradigm at the moment? Is it possible for me to engage someone from Malaysia, for example, by way of technology, and bring them in as talent, as part of manpower? I can engage someone from UK, for example, and bring them in as part of manpower in Singapore. So there's a new breed of employment, which requires new policy thinking on the part of the government, on the part of the company even, in order to extend that. And Singapore can be a hub in order to gather talent from different countries in order to do the work that Singapore companies undertake.
So you're saying Singapore can be a hub for remote work,
yes.
in a way.
That's right.
Excellent. So the next question, Judge, is maybe we can, I think this may be a little better if we look at the camera, and I think the audience may enjoy that a little bit better. So we have, maybe before I go on to my question, let me take a quick, how do we balance, question from Wailun, how do we balance empathy trait while striking for business bottom line and excellence?
That's a very common question, I think, that is being asked by most companies. I think we need to remember, that there is a change now between shareholder value and stakeholder value. When we were looking for stakeholder value, we were looking at purely bottom line, the company's dividends, the company's declaration of assets, etc., etc. But once you change the mindset from shareholdership to stakeholdership, then it becomes a different paradigm.
Correct.
Where then you're concerned not only with the bottom line, but you're concerned with participation in the environment that supports you in order to do that particular business. The fact of that change is an empathetic change. And I think that's important for us to recognize.
Yeah, it's a good point. In fact, 181 of the top CEOs in US have combined together to sign a statement of purpose that they will no longer just be aligned with shareholder value as a purpose, but aligned across 5 dimensions: shareholders, customers, employees, suppliers, and the planet. So I think we are beginning to see that change. One question, a very specific question. We started that discussion last time. It was about the empathy index. Is there something like an empathy index? How do you know that you have reached the optimum architecture for empathy in the company? Is it measurable? Is there has some work been done in that space?
In fact, there is work that's been done. It started in 2016. There is, in fact, cited in UK, where you got an empathy index run by a company called the Empathy Business. So they have teamed up with the World Economic Forum. They brought in the leadership from the Forum of the Young Leaders, and they use technology to be able to do that in order to measure. So if you read the statement that comes out from the Empathy Business, they have listed down various criteria in order to identify which company has got the highest index. So that I would ask you to look at the empathy index by the empathy business. Yeah.
How do you, another question, how do we demonstrate to a hierarchical organization that empathy is powerful and not soft or weak? How would you start, that go beyond being lip service to empathy, because which is what many leaders tend to do?
Yeah, excellent question. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we need to recognize, when I first started off by saying that we need to look at empathy within a framework of logos and ethos. I think that's important. So that framework of logos and ethos, I think, builds up a culture. And we cannot build a culture from top down. We have to build a culture from the ground up. Culture is always grounds up, whether it's social culture, whether it's a technological culture, or whether it's political culture. It's always from the bottom up. And once we recognize that, we need to recognize that our leaders need to recognize, or the CEOs need to recognize, that he cannot thumb down empathy, but he needs to encourage empathy to rise up to the top. And that becomes a culture. So empathy needs to become a culture of a corporation.
So on that, I want to extend that a little further. So from a culture of an organization, can it help differentiate one company from the other? Means, is it a source of differentiation, just like technology excellence is a source of differentiation? Yes. Customer experience is a source of differentiation. Yeah. Is empathy a source of differentiation for a brand, for a company?
So Facebook is an empathetic company. Alphabet is an empathetic company. Netflix is an empathetic company. LinkedIn is an empathetic company. So what is the difference? I think in regard to all these various companies, it is the identifying who your stakeholders are, being clear as to who your beneficiaries are. So they've got discrete beneficiaries, they've got identifiable beneficiaries. I think that's important. And within that group of beneficiaries, we began to understand the patterns, the thoughts, the motivations of the beneficiaries. And that's why they are set apart. That's why they are differentiated from one to the other. But the common idea that all of these companies use, I mentioned Facebook, Alphabet, Netflix, LinkedIn, Unilever, Southwest Airlines, Microsoft, Whole Foods Market, Johnson & Johnson, S&P. Every single one uses empathy within its own design thinking, within its own corporate strategy. But the differentiation is the market segmentation, which they understand right to the detail. And that's important. That's where empathy comes in.
So can you explain that? When you say market segmentation, you mean in terms of understanding exactly where they stand in serving the particular segments or the stakeholders that they are? That's what you mean?
That's right, yeah. That's what I mean.
Excellent.
For example, like Southwest Airlines is my favorite case study. Southwest Airlines is my favorite case study because it really focused on the needs of the travelers, of the passengers. They know what their needs are. They know when they need to be very quiet and not make any announcement. They know where they want to sit, because on Southwest Airlines, you don't have a seat number for your plane. So, but they know the clients well enough to know their preferred seats. So the clients like that. They know the clients would like a cup of coffee 10 minutes after flight, for example. So they've studied the client well enough. So they are experts in that particular market segmentation.
A practical question I think Jas Singh has asked is, how do you apply empathy when you have an unmotivated team member? Real on-the-ground challenge faced by a manager, and you provide them with the support. You still don't know if you're doing enough. How do you deal with it? I once had a colleague I supported for a long time, and eventually I had to let her go. And then eventually she told me, you kept me for so long, you have made me weaker than I would have been. How do you deal with this? I think that's...
Can I answer that in two ways, Manoj, if you don't mind? I'm not making any reference to you.
Yes.
I'm making reference to a research that has been done by Harvard University for a period of 20 years. And the research shows there is no such thing as a deadwood employee, but a deadwood employer. So I think then it becomes the moral responsibility on the part of the employer in order to motivate the particular employee. So he comes within your environment, he comes within your accountability, he comes within your area of supervision, and there is a certain moral obligation to your employee in order to motivate this person in order to do the best with it. So we need to try. And empathy is one of the best tools in order to motivate an unmotivated employer. The employer is not motivated because of what reasons? You need to examine those reasons. And I think that's important to be able to do that.
Excellent. Let's shifting gears a bit, in terms of empathy, and there has been conversation on empathy and design thinking. How do they come together? And is that a new area of research? How do you apply that?
Yeah, I think the new companies are beginning to understand. I mentioned Facebook and all the others early on. These companies are beginning to understand, and more companies are beginning to understand that in terms of design thinking, designing the processes of the company, designing the products of the company, designing the systems of the company, designing the market of the company, that you need to include empathy as part of the design components. So empathy needs to have a seat at the table of design thinking. If empathy is not at the seat of the design table, but only an afterthought, you're going to have lots and lots and losses of money, I think, in regard to that.
Correct.
So it has to be almost imperative that empathy needs to be part of the macro system that is embedded within a company.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Judge. So Scott Main Reed has a question. He says, can we provide tangible benefits in terms of, I lost the question. Can we provide tangible benefits in terms of short, medium, and long term in regards to empathetic management?
Provide what, sorry?
Can we provide tangible benefits?
Tangible benefits, yeah.
It can be measured.
Yeah.
Can empathy be measured in short, medium, and long term?
Yeah. I think, thank you for that question. I think empathy must always be measurable. I think that's important. That's the basic principle of empathy. Why must it be measurable? Because you are looking at patterns and thinking, and practical empathy is really looking about how do you make use of the data that you have? How do you make use of the patterns and the thinking and express that into what you want to produce, or what you want to achieve for a particular company? So number one, it must be measurable. And I think especially in the fashion business, it is measurable in terms of short-term tangibility, medium-term tangibility, and long-term tangibility. I think that's important. So it depends on the product that you have. Even in financial products, they would have also medium-term, short-term, and long-term products. For example, like if you have a bond which runs for 10 years, a bond which runs for 20 years, or you want to have a short-term bond for 5 years. But does that meet the needs of the market? In order to decide that, you need to do empathetic research. You need to employ empathetic trends in order to decide that. Because otherwise, you will not be able to decide whether it's a 5-year bond or a 10-year bond or a 20-year bond, for example. Like in fashion, you can't decide whether you need to have slim fit trousers or not slim fit trousers, or whether the trousers needs to be torn and teared at a certain point within the anatomy, for example. All that is part of empathetic research. So, Scott, thank you for that question. It has to have measurable, it has to be tangible, short-term, long-term, and as well as long-term. That is the maturity of the company.
Which company does it well? Is there any example would you like to give? Is it again these tech leaders? If you were to give a case study, or if you were to talk about a company, big or small, or public government or NGO?
Yeah, just now we were in the room and Wuntek was taking photographs of us. He was using an iPhone 12. An iPhone 12 can be used in order to make a movie, for example. How did Apple arrive at a product called iPhone 12? I'm using an iPhone 7. I'm outdated by a few generations in regard to that. But there is a need for someone like Wuntek to be able to use an iPhone 12. How do Apple do that? It does that by empathetic algorithm, addictive technology, which they use. They watch your pattern. They watch how much time do you use your phone. They watch how much time do you use your camera, what you use your camera for. So it becomes addictive technology. And so Apple is a fantastic example of what is happening within an empathetic company.
Excellent. Scott Dewhurst. I apologize, Scott, if I get your last name wrong. He's saying, with empathy being one of the 5 domains of emotional intelligence, is it possible that organizations could create emotionally intelligent cultures with practical empathy being the foundation? I suppose.
Good question, Scott. I think we need to recognize that there is such a thing as IQ, such a thing as EQ, and such a thing as EI, which is the empathy index. I think that becomes quite important. IQ and EQ, I think we know that these are very conventional features that we need to have of a person, of a particular company. Practical empathy then comes in order to collaborate all these patterns of IQ and EQ in order to make that more tangible in terms of what is my final product? What do I offer which is differentiated from another product to the market, to my consumers, to my beneficiaries? I think in regard to that. In the philanthropic world, Scott, empathy is a huge, big thing, bigger than IQ. What is required is empathy and EQ. So it depends on the industry that you're particularly in. And I'd say, yes, it is one of the qualities that we need to bear in mind, but it is an indispensable quality, empathy.
Is there Pradyut Das is asking, is there a strategy or evaluation technique to understand a person's empathetic quality?
Yes, I think that's an amazing thing. Well, there have been quite a number of research done by quite well-known psychologists who actually have devised measures in order to ascertain the progress of an employee, the progress of manpower in the corporation, whether or not empathy has been optimized. I think the challenge is really whether optimization of empathy has been reached or not in a particular company. So that's always a challenge. And in order to ascertain the challenge, various index have been used in order to be able to measure that. Well, I think time does not permit me to give you a lot of these research findings. But if you look at the internet and you look at the American Psychological Association, for example, you'll be able to find some of these empathy indexes or measurements that are available.
Craig has a question. He says, I try to manage and this I'm sure applies to many of us. I try to manage in an empathetic manner and support colleagues as individuals. But I've received feedback from many colleagues that I'm not tough enough. I'm too soft, and it is having an impact on the team. And how do I obtain a good balance?
Right. Yeah. I think first of all, it depends on what your understanding of empathy really is. Empathy is not sympathy. Empathy is not sympathy. You do not identify with a person's pain or suffering. You can be objective about it, right? You do not stand into the shoes of the person and take on the psyche of the person. That is not the role of an empathetic leader. The role of the empathetic leader is to understand the person's needs and yet detach enough for you to be able to deal with the person in a practical way, not only for his benefit, but also for your benefit. Because otherwise, you would have empathetic burnt out. And I think that's quite dangerous, I think, for companies to be able to have. So empathy, not sympathy, that is required. Sympathy always leaves you to the soft part of human interaction and human relationship. Empathy is slightly standoffish, if you like. It gives you a little dignity to you, to the other person. You respect the other person and you deal with the other person's needs and wants, and his motivations, I think, becomes important.
I think as a follow-up to that question, Judge, and maybe a more practical, relevant example is, can you had 40 years as a judge in legal service. I'm sure at times you have had to make a tough decision where, sympathy, empathy, and taking the right decision. And is there something you could share with us as a lesson or a practical takeaway?
I think all judges are empathetic.
Mm.
All judges are empathetic. They're empathetic to the cause of justice. They're empathetic that fairness is being done. They're empathetic to equality. They're empathetic to these principles of dignity of a person. All judges need to be empathetic. If you find a judge who is not empathetic, then that is not the definition of a good judge. Whether it's in Singapore, whether it's in UK or in any other place, a judge needs to be empathetic to the cause of that. So whenever I sit on the bench, one of the first things I tell myself is, here there is a case, and I need to be empathetic to the cause of justice.
Cause of
At the
justice.
same time, I need to be empathetic to the cause of mercy too, at the same time. So I have to balance that. And this is where judgment becomes quite pronounced. And that differentiates one judge from another judge. It is the ability to make sound judgment or good judgment, or sometimes it's called judicious judgment, I think in regard to a particular matter that comes before a person. Take a family case, for example. The wife wants custody of the child, the father wants custody of the child, and you look at the child has got no voice. He doesn't speak up, because who then speaks for the voice of the child? So you need to be empathetic to the needs of the mother, to the needs of the father, but at the same time, you need to be empathetic to the child. So what judges have done is to devise a principle that will help the judge in order to be empathetic. And that principle in that case, which I just mentioned, is that it must be in the best interest of the child. So that is an empathetic principle. So I decide and I lean towards whether or not this is the best interest of the child. Is it the best interest of the child to be with a mother or to be with a father? So that's an empathetic principle. Yes.
This, I think, thank you for that incredible insight. And, I think empathy also is not about sympathy. And I think maybe that's where people confuse and we make a mistake. How do we build an empathetic team? In many instances, we can say, oh, the organization is not empathetic. My senior leaders are not doing it. But at least within our teams, we can follow that.
Yeah.
And it is something which is not taught in business schools also. I don't think there is this, I didn't study it in my business school when I did it. But how do we go about building an empathetic team?
I think first, there need to be a recognition that empathy needs to be the DNA of a company, because we're building a culture. So what is the culture's DNA? It is empathy. I think that's important. Yeah. So there must be a recognition. Everybody must get together. There's a shared value that empathy needs to be part of the DNA of the company. The next question, of course, is what do we do next? How do we apply this DNA to that particular company? How do we apply this at all? Whether we apply this purely at the subordinate level, whether we apply this at the supervisory level, or do we apply this from the board level onwards, etc. But if you want to establish a culture, as we talked along just now, that it must be from the ground up and all the way up to the board to be able to say, we are an empathetic company. Let me give you an example. Microsoft, the CEO of Microsoft, whenever he meets his employees, he would say, we are an empathetic company. Yeah. He says that the reason why Microsoft has turned around is because it's an empathetic company. So everybody buys this word. It becomes a buzz. The word empathy becomes a buzz within Microsoft. So if you walk around Microsoft, everybody will, if you say, wow, are you empathetic today? They will say, yeah, thumbs up. Oh, we're empathetic today. So this is what Sardella does in the Microsoft industry. We need to be able to say we're an empathetic company.
Paul,
CMI has done it.
Yeah.
CMI has started to do it. Yeah.
Excellent. Paul Williams here from the UK. He's saying he's enjoying the webinar. Hello, Paul. He says, to what extent is empathy different across the world? Is it different as you go from one region to another?
Yeah.
How do you, okay, maybe that is the first question. I don't want to confuse with the next one because that's equally interesting.
Okay, I think it depends on whether you talk about social empathy. If you talk about social empathy, of course, it is different across the world because you have to deal with cultural differences, cultural nuances, etc. But if you're talking about corporate empathy, and if it is a company which is multinational company, it is cited in many places in the world, that particular empathy then becomes a pervasive part of the company's culture across, because you're dealing with market segmentation of a particular group of people. So that becomes important for us to remember. If you're talking about political empathy, of course, it depends on the countries that you have. In Britain, I think it's different. In Singapore, it's different when you talk about political empathy. Or in terms of the financial industry, which traverses boundaries and sites, or medical empathy, which goes beyond boundaries, that we do not have any specific cultural differences. So empathy depends on what we're talking about, Paul, whether it's a social relationship, whether it's a corporate relationship, or whether it's a relationship that goes online beyond digital boundaries, and then the empathy emphasis becomes quite different. So, for example, like Singapore Airlines flies to London, for example. The stewardess cannot say, when I fly to London and I bring people back from London to Singapore, I must have Singapore empathetic DNA. Otherwise, I won't recognize that particular part. You can't survive as a company, be able to do that.
Got it. The follow-on question from Paul is, how do US tech companies, I think you have talked about several of them as great examples, how do they ensure that they're empathetic and can support people from other places, other cultures, and be consistent in the delivery of empathy across the world?
So if you look at the 10 best empathetic companies, which I mentioned early on, which have been voted the top companies, 60% of them are technology companies. So what does that mean? They mean that they use technology, machine learning. They use algorithms in order to work out market motivations, market needs. They work out a projection of the market needs. And if you had seen the movie on Netflix, which talks about how technology companies relate to consumers, you will know that they put in an addictive technology within their own systems, so that it now constrains your conduct. It helps you to change your conduct towards an affinity for their own particular products. So that's how these companies have been working at it. Well, whether the ethics is right or not is a different issue altogether. So you need to talk about empathy and ethics together. So we go back to the first premise that we talked about. Empathy needs to be ethical and needs to be coherent logically.
So, I think I want to just stick with that. What is the connection between ethics and empathy? Maybe we should explore that a bit more. You said it should be ethical, and at the same time, sorry, I missed that part.
Okay. So if I were a company and I was interested in child pornography, so for example, and I think there's a lot of demand around the world on child pornography. Many people have been arrested in Thailand, etc., etc. And these people have come as far away as other countries, in other foreign countries. And what do they look at? They look at websites where these are being held. And the websites know that these are the people looking for child pornography. But do I want to do it? The answer is no, it's not ethical. I don't want to be able to do that. So that is empathy of the consumers, but it's an unethical empathy. Should companies be encouraged to do that? Of course, the answer is no. So that's a clear example about the relationship and the marriage between empathy and ethics at the same time. And I think to maintain a high level of company sustainability, the company needs to have a high moral ground, a high legitimacy, high tangibility. And that high tangibility and legitimacy is because of ethical empathy. I think that's important for us to recognize.
Excellent. Maybe, Judge, before I pick up some more questions, maybe I want to go back to fundamental basic. What is practical empathy again? Maybe it'd be good to hear it from you.
Practical empathy is always about the question how. Empathy is always about the question what. What is the thinking pattern? What is the motivation? What are the needs of the market? So that is the what of empathy. What practical empathy does is gather all this particular data and then makes sense of the data. It collaborates the data, it infuses the data, it segmentizes the data, it distills the data, and then began to apply the data to use of the data to what has been gathered. So practical empathy is about how we use, gather, and collaborate the data and the thinking pattern and the motivations. That is practical empathy.
Excellent. Thank you. We have a question from Anthony. How do you think empathy varies across generations? And relevant, I think maybe we should take it more from a business context in a company.
Yeah. So I gave an example of my good friend Wuntek using an iPod, an iPhone 12, for example. That's meant for the younger generation. And Wuntek is a young man at heart. He's a very young man at heart. Yeah, so iPhone 12 is meant for the younger generation. Why do you do that? Because they want to capitalize on the fact that you are able to capture the moving scenes of life as it happens. You can turn your phone into a movie camera. You're a director, you're a script writer, and then you can put life's journey together. So that is one of the market segmentation. So for the young people, I think the millennial around the world are going to form the majority of the market segmentation in the world. In ASEAN, for example, 60% of our population are among the millennial groups. So there's a great market, I think, for them.
Excellent. How can a workforce, we'll take some quick rapid fire ones now, because we are coming, we want to try and see if we can wrap up very quickly. How can a workforce influence change where a non-empathetic management culture exists?
Yeah. Challenging to be able to do that. I've sat on several boards, and one of the first things I notice is if the management is not empathetic, it's going to fail. The company is going to fail, the operations will just fall to the ground. It's just antithetical to this idea about how we run a business. It is almost impossible to be run a business. You don't have to go very far. You go to a sandwich shop, and if you go to the sandwich shop, if it ignores you about what your needs are, the sandwich shop will close almost immediately. So you need to be empathetic to that.
Excellent. Judge, for all of us who have not, let's say, read enough about empathy, practiced enough empathy, are there some great books you recommend? Any great literature we should look at? Some tips?
I think I will only recommend my lecturers at the Harvard Business School. They have written great books. And I think if the great books are available on Amazon.com, but Harvard Business School also provides great articles on empathies. So all you have to do is look at the internet, and you'll find some great articles written by the Harvard professors on empathies. They're wonderful articles. They are quite current, I think, in terms of their research, and they are evidence-based views which they make.
And as we come out of this pandemic, is empathy of that era going to be different? And what does it mean for us as managers to respond to that?
I think the pandemic has caused us to be more empathetic. We have become acutely aware of being empathetic. For example, like I'm sitting about 1 meter away from Manoj here, and Wuntek is sitting another 2 meters away from me on the other side. We become a little bit more empathetic, acutely more empathetic. And I think this virtue is not going to be lost on us. Companies are beginning to find that this is one way of really understanding the business a bit better, understanding the mindset a bit better. So, for example, in Singapore, you have got public transport operators who have now tendered for new rail lines or new bus routes. They have become empathetic to the needs of the constituencies within the particular area where the buses are going to be run. And they have taken time in order to do research, to do focus group discussions, to find out what the needs of the people, what the motivations are. So they become more and more aware of that. And I think that's a good thing.
Excellent. So thank you very much, Judge. It has been 45 minutes of incredible, high-paced learning, and I see the comments, and I think people have benefited incredibly. I've jotted down 8 key points, which I learned newer, and it may be different for people. They can add to it, or they can write or connect with us on LinkedIn or any of the other channels. Let me quickly summarize the 8 key things that I wrote down. Which the first one is, it is about defining through the stakeholders lens, because that in itself gives us a better answer to what we are after, so that you are not empathetic just to the person who is talking to you, but the empathy to the stakeholders that you serve, and therein lies maybe the mistake that many of us make. Second is that empathy should be measurable, medium term, long term. If it is not measurable, then we are not just practicing empathy. Third, there is such thing as an empathy index, and how do you practice it? How do you inculcate it? And that is what organizations should be looking at. Fourth one, you said, empathy is not an afterthought. It's not that you come up with the company and then you say, hey, oh, by the way, we have to be empathetic. Empathy needs to have a seat at the table, just like a customer is having a seat at the table in many organizations these days. A practical thing that you told me is, Manoj, every employee is of great value. It is for the employer to find out where that value is of that employee to serve your company. Sixth one, empathy is not sympathy. And maybe people mistake it all the time. I think you really highlighted in many ways the use of technology for empathy. And I think technology has a big role to play to help us deliver consistent empathy, or operate consistently in an empathetic manner around the world. And final is, we talked about ethics and empathy. So there is a high legitimacy is possible because we have ethical empathy. Right?
Yes.
So, Judge, any final words from you as we conclude this session?
I hope you have been empathetic to me for causing you distress at the first session. So thank you very much for listening. And I appreciate the question that you raised and the remarks that you have given from where I can see. So thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you very much, Judge. And Mel, from here in Singapore, back to you in London.
Thank you very much. That is it for today's session, and thank you to everyone who has joined us today. Thank you, Manoj and Judge Magnus, for your insights and expertise. If you're a member of CMI, log into Management Direct using the link in the live chat comments. You can find thousands of inclusive, practical development resources and plenty more. Not yet subscribed? Why not join our community via the link in the live chat comments again to gain full access to our Management Direct portal. You can also sign up to the free CMI newsletter via managers.org.uk. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day and evening.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.